So the talk that I've prepared for you all today is called How to Calm Your Mind. Now, as Michael was saying off the intro there, I like to study the science of personal productivity for a living. And I'm not sure if you've encountered much in the way of personal productivity advice, but if you have, one of the very first things you've probably realized is there is a lot of it out there. You walk down the bookstore aisle and you see books on how to think like Leonardo da Vinci and eat that frog and become a highly effective person. There are a lot of experts out there who have their 10-step trademarked, all rights reserved solutions for becoming more productive. And then there are the websites that promise to help us live a life of productivity. And so as to not discriminate against anybody in the space, I've included my own website off in the corner there. But here's the thing about productivity advice. For every minute you spend consuming it, you have to make that time back and then some, right? Because it's productivity advice. It should ultimately, hopefully, make us more productive. And there are good books out there that help us accomplish this purpose, like Getting Things Done, Atomic Habits. There are incredible researchers out there too. Peter Gollwitzer, who studies intentionality, Tim Pitchell, who studies procrastination, Gloria Mark, who studies attention. But then if this advice falls on this side of the productivity spectrum, then you have the stuff that doesn't allow us to make back time that falls all the way over on this end. One of my favorite, actually entertaining examples of these are these life hacks that are all over the internet that are very, sometimes convenient, but maybe they don't make us back time. Here's one of them. If you put a wooden spoon on top of a pot of boiling water, it pops all the bubbles and prevents the water from boiling over. Pretty incredible, but it gets absurd relatively quickly. Let's say you have some leftover chips that you want to store somewhere. Just get an old coat hanger and use a clip from there. Or maybe, this next one's my favorite, and I'm pretty sure it's a joke. Maybe you're at home, you're relaxing, you just gave yourself an at-home pedicure or something, and you can't find any sandals nearby. Well, just get a couple of water bottles and fashion those like this, I presume fella did. And I love this picture so much. I love the hair. But anyway, gross memes aside, there's a lot of advice embedded within this productivity space. So about a decade ago, I thought, okay, somebody has to volunteer here and filter out all of this stuff and find the stuff that actually works, that actually allows us to make progress. And for better or for worse, personal productivity has been this weird passion of mine since I can remember. So it was at this point that I volunteered and started to filter out the stuff that works from the stuff that doesn't. And what I found over the ensuing decade or so is that there are three main areas that the best advice tends to come from. There's the academic literature, the actual journal articles, the research, the peer-reviewed science on how we can become more productive, on how personal performance even works. There are the interviews, from chatting with corporate leaders to productivity authors. And then there are a bunch of experiments that I like to conduct on myself around these ideas, which I'll share with you a bit today. And these three pillars have formed the foundation for the work that I've tried to contribute through today. My other book, Hyperfocus, and my other book, The Productivity Project. And these form the foundation upon which the story that led to my third book, How to Calm Your Mind, reside. So things are going great with this productivity stuff. I was writing about topics that I loved, experimenting, interviewing experts, and then, giving talks about these very ideas as well. And I still remember it was maybe 5 years ago or so, I was on stage giving a talk on productivity when suddenly my world stopped. Beads of sweat started to form on the back of my neck. My heart rate spiked. I started speaking as though there were a dozen or so marbles in my mouth, and I was in fight, flight, or freeze mode, having, I realized looking back, a panic attack on stage in front of this particular group that I was speaking to. Now, luckily, in this particular session, I made it through the rest of the talk on autopilot mode. But afterwards, I headed up to the hotel room that I was giving this presentation at and really went through things in my head. And I realized that as far as productivity advice had gotten me, I needed to invest in calm at the same time. This anxiety was metastasizing in my life. It didn't have anywhere to go, and it boiled over on stage that particular day. So I remember lying down in one of the two queen-size beds in the hotel room. It was one of these hotel rooms where there's two beds, even though it's just you staying there, and thinking, I am not in a good place right now. And it was at this low point in this journey towards calm that I recall asking a very simple question. What did I have to do in order to experience calm and make it last? We all have these fleeting moments of calm in our life, but how can we have calm as a constant companion in our days and not just on the odd trip to the Dominican Republic or somewhere warm for vacation? And so I did basically the only thing I know how to do at the time. I took this approach where, I interviewed people, I ran experiments on myself, I looked at the academic research, but instead of productivity, I shifted the lens to point at topics that were related to calm, that were tangentially related and directly related to unfold and unravel this picture of what calm even is and how we can get there in this modern world that we have to reside inside of. And there were three kind of topics that I turned my attention to over the arc of this journey: stress, burnout, and anxiety. So we'll cover each of these in turn. We'll get our hands a bit dirty with the research first of all, and then we'll get tactical, and then Michael will hop back on and we'll have a conversation about these things using the questions that you submit throughout the presentation. But let's start with stress, digging into the research a little bit, because quickly you realize, looking at the research, the fundamental role that stress plays in our mental health. And this was something, because I hadn't really turned my attention to this topic that much before this journey, that surprised me, that really shouldn't have been a surprise, but some lessons quickly became apparent about stress. Three of them, in fact. First of which is that there are two kinds of stress that we all face each and every day. Now, this might be something that you have heard already, but it was news to me at the time that we all have two different kinds of stress that comprise the total stress picture in our life. There's the acute stress, and then there's the chronic stress. And so acute stress is temporary. It's once off. It's akin to a tunnel that we must navigate through in order to get to the light on the other side. And on the other hand, chronic stress is repeated. It's chronic. It never feels as though it's going to end. And so we all have a lot of stress in our life. In most cases, more stress than we've ever had before, different kinds, different amounts. And so I started to take an inventory of my own. I combined my own stressors with a bunch of common examples out there. And when we're in an episode of stress, we feel as though things are not going well, and we're most definitely in an unpleasant situation, or a situation that we appraise as unpleasant in the present moment, as we'll talk about. But we can totally divide a line right in the middle, where on one side of it is the acute stress on the left-hand side here, the stuff that's temporary, the stuff that ends. And because there's an end in sight, we relate to it differently. We can divide that out from the stuff that is chronic, that feels as though it's never going to end. And so acute stress is interesting in this way, where if you went back through your life and you eliminated basically every source of acute stress, the stuff that's temporary and once off, you would probably be making a big mistake, as weird as that might sound, because acute stress is not pleasant in the moment, but it also forces us to grow. It gives us no choice but to grow, to rise to the level of the events that are unfolding. If you scrubbed out, in fact, all the episodes of acute stress in your life, you'd get rid of the big family gatherings where, your uncle goes off on some weird rant. You'd get rid of the weddings, the moments that force you to grow. But that's an acute stress. Chronic stress, on the other hand, as we'll get to, is the garbage kind of stress. It's the no good, very bad kind of stress because we experience it chronically. And in this way, it feels as though it's never going to end. And the research also shows, and this was the point in the research project, that things quickly got fascinating to me because the research shows that chronic stress leads to one phenomenon that is actually quite misunderstood in our modern work environment. That phenomenon is burnout, right? Burnout is caused by one thing and one thing only, and that is chronic stress that doesn't let up. In fact, if you look at how burnout is defined clinically in research, it's defined as an occupational phenomenon that is the result of the totality of our chronic stress that has not been sufficiently managed. And I've highlighted a couple of words here: occupational phenomenon. It's traditionally defined as an occupational phenomenon because most of our stress comes from work. Most of our chronic stress comes from work, some of which is unpreventable, some of which is. And I've also highlighted the totality of our chronic stress because it's in this way that there is a point in our situation where once we have too much chronic stress, we cross a threshold of sorts and are just unable to manage it all. And that is when we reach a point of burnout. And the fascinating thing is, going into this research journey, I thought burnout was exhaustion. I think, as a lot of people do. We use the two words interchangeably, colloquially even too. We say, oh, I'm so burnt out, I had a long day at work today, when we really mean exhaustion. But exhaustion is really just 1/3 of the picture of what it means to be fully burnt out. We do need to be exhausted, right? That feeling of being just totally wrecked and depleted and having nothing left in the tank. But we also need for two other things to be true about our situation. We also need to feel cynical, right? If you notice more negativity and cynicism pervading through the world right now, it could just be because of the chronic stress. And unproductive is the last attribute of what it means to be burnt out. We need to feel as though what we're spending our time, our attention, our energy on every day does not make a difference. And so it's in this way. Remember that burnout is the result of the totality of chronic stress that we face. And so it's in this way we can kind of design a little rudimentary chart of sorts to visualize this phenomenon, where the total amount of chronic stress we face is on the left, and there is a threshold near the top where that is our point of burnout, where once the chronic stress we face crosses that precipice, we experience exhaustion, cynicism, and we feel significantly less productive. And so in this way, we stack all the stress that we face. We have the stress from work, which is usually the biggest source of stress by a wide, wide margin. On top of that, our relationships, it's family. Maybe on top of that is this economy, maybe money concerns, and maybe things are humming along just fine. But then, oh, wait, wait a sec. There's a global pandemic. And so that pushes us over the edge, the chronic stress that's associated with an event such as that. We become more exhausted. We become more cynical. We feel less productive at the same time. But again, and I've kind of expanded and shrunk the items on this here chart to be visible. But work usually indeed is the biggest source of stress that most of us face. And of course, these days, our boundaries between our work and our home lives have become more of a gradient than a dividing line. And so that's worth keeping in mind, that a lot of the chronic stress that contributes to burnout is tough to categorize sometimes. But the chronic stress that we face at work, the research shows comes from 6 main places. And so if you have a pen and a sheet of paper, be sure to capture these. And we'll talk about them a bit more in a second as well. But there are 6 areas of our work that serve as sort of petri dishes that chronic stress can incubate inside of. First of all, workload, right? When our workload is too damn high, it adds more stress, makes us more likely to burn out. Control is the second one. The less control we have over when, where, and how we do things, the more likely we are to burn out. Fairness is the third factor. Fairness with how work is assigned, with how we're treated, with how we're rewarded. Reward is the fourth factor. So this has everything to do with financial compensation, but also just being recognized for the contributions that we make. Right? We need to feel valued, and rewards of all kinds make us feel that way. Community is the fifth factor. Feeling connected with the people that we work alongside. That's what gives us that pride of work, speaking of such, right? The less community we have, the more chronic stress we experience, the more likely we are to burn out. And the final factor is values. And so values are quite fascinating, but it really just comes down to whether we feel as though our work is an expression of who we are. If we value community, if we value getting along with others, if we value making a difference, and our work allows us to do that, we feel less burnt out. We feel more engaged. And indeed, engagement, as shown by the research, is the opposite of burnout. And usually, and this is something I found in my own situation, deconstructing it, the anxiety I was experiencing and the stress and the burnout that was associated with it, I realized that not all of the factors in my life were out of whack. Values, reward, fairness, control, we're all pretty good. I'm an entrepreneur, and so those were doing pretty good at the time. But workload, by God, was quite high, too high, in fact. And community, I didn't have much to speak of because I'm a solopreneur for the most part. I have a small team, but they're all remote. And so there's less of a community than I wished for. And so that got me over the burnout threshold, along with the other sources of stress in my days. That's the second thing to know about stress, especially chronic stress. Third, a lot of the stress in our life is hidden from our view. Now, there's 2 main examples that kept coming up in the research, and the key here is to recognize that a lot of the chronic stress that we tend to by choice, because it's gotten comfortable to us. The news is a very good example of something that falls into this category. In fact, in the last presentation that we were doing, I shared a study, which I'll share again today because it's so profound and it made such a difference in my thinking. But it was conducted around the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. And what the team of researchers did is they looked at 2 groups of people. The first group of people were those who watched 6 or more hours of news coverage about the bombings. And the second group of people were runners in the actual marathon. And what the team of researchers found was that those who watched 6 or more hours of news coverage were more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder and ranked their stress higher than somebody who was in the marathon and personally affected by it. Right? Just because a source of stress is familiar and a habit doesn't mean that it doesn't negatively affect our life and the amount of chronic stress that we face. Second source is social media. Of course it is. What else would it be? There was one quote that really stuck out at me from Frances Hogan. Speaking of Meta, maybe I won't apply for this job at Meta after watching her congressional testimony. But she essentially boiled the Instagram algorithm down to two things: bodies and comparing lifestyles. It's no wonder she wanted to blow the whistle on this company. It's hard to imagine lower level emotions than that, right? That activate the comparison part of our mind, make us feel inadequate, and not only inadequate, but also stressed out, right? So if the work stress, if the home stress doesn't push us over the edge, maybe the hidden stress does. And not only this, but in the previous presentation as well, if you have a chance, be sure to watch the recording of it if it's still available. But we have this active bias in our mind that can work against our goals in this regard. There's something called the novelty bias embedded within our brain's prefrontal cortex, the logical portion of our mind, whereby for every new and novel thing we direct our attention at, our mind rewards us with a hit of dopamine, right? This chemical that leads us to feel as though pleasure is right around the corner, but never really leads us to feel pleasure in and of itself. And so we don't just have this hidden stress, we have this hidden stress that causes us more stress because of how stimulating it is for our mind. We fly at this high level of stimulation, propelled forward by dopamine, which leads us to take on more stress, whether it's hidden or not, because of our overstimulated mind. So, 3 things to know about stress. Now, let's get tactical with this, shall we? Enough doom and gloom. Some of the biggest inroads that I personally made towards taming my own anxiety came when I asked a very simple question of the research. That question was, what is the opposite of anxiety? We tend to think of anxiety as a spectrum that goes from anxious all the way down to a state of not being anxious at all. But what is apparent from the research is fascinating. And it shows that this point of no anxiety doesn't live at the end of the spectrum, as we might think. It actually exists in the middle of the spectrum. And what exists on the other side is this idea of calm, where we become less emotionally reactive to circumstances as they change around us, where we relate to our thoughts in a positive manner, and where our mind, our mental state is less agitated. And indeed, because this makes us less emotionally reactive, we move away from anxiety. We have the capacity to raise our burnout threshold so we can absorb more stress. And so, what I've done is I've chosen 5 strategies that will work wonders for you for investing in calm, for overcoming anxiety and burnout, and dealing with and absorbing the stress that we all have. One note to keep in mind before we dig in: take what works for you and leave the rest. If there's another thing that was apparent from the research over this journey, is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for calming your mind. Just as there isn't some cookie cutter system for becoming more productive each and every day. We're all wired differently. We have different personalities. We have different work constraints. We have different constraints in our home life. Take what works for you, leave the rest. Not all of this will work for you. That's the point. So take what works for you, leave the rest. All right. Enough preamble. Number one is the 2-minute burnout checkup. By the way, if you want to dig more into this idea, on Monday, I published an article in the Harvard Business Review. I think it's still on the homepage of the website that details this in detail. So the 2-minute burnout inventory is one of the simplest rituals in the world. And, there are scientifically validated instruments for measuring how close you are to burning out. The Maslach burnout inventory is one of them. I think it costs about $30 to do. But if you're looking for something that's lighter weight, that you can track over time, this is one of my favorite rituals for charting burnout. So all you have to do is rank how much stress you experience from each of these 6 burnout factors out of 10 to determine how close you are to the burnout side of the spectrum versus the engagement side of the spectrum. And so maybe your workload is really, really high right now. And so that's a 9. Experience a lot of stress from it. Maybe you have a lot of control, though, over when, where, and how you do it. So that's a 3. Reward. Maybe you're well paid, but not recognized enough for the contributions that you make. So maybe that's a 4. Community. Maybe COVID obliterated the sense of community you have at work. So that's an 8. Fairness. Maybe things are pretty fair where you work. So that's a 2. Maybe you also feel as though you can manifest your values through your daily actions at work. So that's a 3. Composite score in this example, 29. And so we can chart this over time. And when you do this, pay special attention to the numbers that are 7 or above. Not all of these factors will be out of whack for you, as I mentioned, but some of them will likely be. And this is not only a way of optimizing how burnt out you are and minimizing how burnt out you are, it's also a way of maximizing your productivity. Because when the opposite of burnout is engagement, and engagement is the process through which we actually become more productive every day, this is an activity worth investing in for productivity reasons alone. So the 2-minute burnout checkup. Number 1, in the can. Number 2, vagus nerve stimulation. Now, if the burnout checkup is a way of checking up on how well we're doing overall, the vagus nerve stimulation is more of an immediate term solution. If you're giving a big presentation, if you're about to have a difficult conversation, if you're going into a negotiation, what vagus nerve stimulation does is the vagus nerve is a part of our body's parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us down physiologically. There's a few ways of doing it. Number 1 is yawning. Now, yawning is interesting because even seeing the word yawning makes us more likely to yawn. I don't know if any of you are taking the bait. I can't see through the Zoom thing to the other side, but try yawning now if you'd like. Seeing the word yawning 5 times makes us more likely to want to yawn. Seeing visual images of people yawning, of cute baby animals yawning, of babies yawning makes us more likely to yawn. Yawning is not a strategy that we necessarily go to before giving an important speech or something, but it's invaluable. And I think if you have yawned over the last few minutes, you've probably found it calming in a way. Second strategy for activating our body's parasympathetic nervous system is using expansive eyes. When we naturally want to soak in a scene, we see out of our full field of view. We don't just, hyper focus on a specific point in space and time. No. Think about when you're at a wonderful resort, maybe again, that Dominican resort, and you're looking out at the ocean. There's a reason a picture never quite captures how an ocean looks. When we see out of our expansive eyes, out of our peripheral vision, our mind calms down. It knows everything is going to be okay. Right? Whether it's the ocean, whether it's the night sky, seeing with the full field of view. Helpful strategy. Third and final strategy for activating our body's sympathetic nervous system is diaphragmatic breathing. And so this is where you inhale deep into your core and exhale for longer than you inhale for. And so let's try a couple. I don't know what situation you're in right now. You're probably in front of a computer soaking in this webinar, but I will guide you through a very quick one, and just notice if you're able to let your shoulders down and feel a bit calmer. So I'll get a watch face on my, okay. I will guide us in for 4, hold for 7, and out for 8. So let's go in, hold, out for 8. In for 4, hold, out for 8. I don't know if you were able to let your shoulders down there at all, but super helpful strategy. And I'm sure you probably found one of those worked better for you. Third strategy is to conduct a stimulation fast. And I'll probably stop at this strategy and go to the conclusion, because I want time for questions and answers after. So a stimulation fast is one of my all-time favorite strategies for finding calm. And, we're at this high level of stimulation, usually because of all the novelty we tend to over the course of the day, the especially dopamine-driven novelty, stuff that is stimulating in the moment that we end up viewing as a distraction after we end our time with that object of attention. And so we bounce around often between a lot of different screens, which are full of dopamine, full of this wonder chemical in some ways and harmful chemical in other ways. But what it means is we fly at this high level of stimulation, always seeking out further distraction. So what a stimulation fast does is it's a shortcut for lowering the stimulation level of our mind. And indeed, there's 4 steps involved in conducting one. So the first step, one of my favorite steps in this, is to identify the dopamine-driven novelty that you want to eliminate. And so a lot of these are what psychologists call super stimuli. So these highly desirable things that we wish to focus on that have the desirable bits cranked up to 11. And so, processed takeout food, social media, online news that refreshes every few minutes, all examples of super stimuli. The second step, identify substitutes, preferably analog ones, to sub in for these distractions, right? Because once we eliminate these distractions for a period of time, there will be a hole in our schedule where they used to be. So we need substitutes for it, whether that's an instrument you haven't picked up in a while, whether that's a hobby that you want to get back into, whether that's a board game in your house that you've been meaning to try that's still wrapped, whether that's a physical book. Analog ones are preferred. If calm is found in the analog world, anxiety is often found in the digital world. And one simple heuristic that I found, by the way, for managing time between them, when meaning matters, go analog. When efficiency matters, go digital. So quick kind of heuristic, but identify substitutes. Choose a duration of time. I like to do this for about a period of a month or so, and then notice what changes. every single thing that we tend to over the course of the day, the week, lives at a different altitude of stimulation, depending on how dopaminergic it is, depending on how novel it is, depending on how much dopamine it releases. And so we've got the social media at the top, of course, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, probably below those a little bit. We have the analog super stimuli, alcohol, processed takeout food. Then we have the more meaningful objects of attention, family time, maybe taking photographs, playing the piano, cooking, meditation. These are examples of mine. Meditation, of course, being near the very bottom of this. Email, probably near the top as well, depending on what kind of emails you get. Online shopping near the top. Giving talks for me is also quite stimulating. I enjoy it. Checking book sales is there as well. Retail shopping, lower than analog shopping. Writing is closer to the bottom. Reading research papers is closer to meditation than anything else. And bookkeeping near the bottom as well. These are the tasks that comprise my day, but maybe your day as well. And then we have our average height of stimulation, right? That we kind of fly at over the course of the day. And what a stimulation fast does is, see this upper band of activities on the screen here? It eliminates those, which lowers our average height of stimulation. And we naturally want to gravitate upwards in this chart to take on things that are more stimulating over time. And what a stimulation fast does is it brings us back down to earth. Tasks become easier. The things that are possible things to focus on over the course of the day are more productive. They're more meaningful. Look at what's left. Most of it matters more than the other factors. So that is number 3, the stimulation fast. So 5, scratch that, 3 strategies for finding calm. Something will inevitably happen when you invest in calm. And that is that you'll probably feel guilty about that time, right? Adjusting our stimulation level downwards has this weird way of making us feel guilty. But I want to absolve you of that guilt to end this presentation by sharing with you something that I discovered about productivity in this journey towards calm. That is that calm, we have this guilt associated with it. But the research shows that calm actually saves us time. We don't even need research for this. We all have examples of this. Let's say, for example, that you're giving a presentation to 5,000 people in 5 minutes, right? You're probably fretting, you're probably nervous, you're probably anxious if this sort of thing makes you anxious. And let's say in this moment, I asked you to multiply 84 by 67 in your head. How much longer would it take you to multiply those two numbers before this big presentation compared to on a random Wednesday? Probably significantly longer, maybe double, maybe triple. Maybe imagine you're in airplane turbulence and you're trying to hunker down on some important paper or write something. How much longer does it take you to do your work with that anxious state of mind? Now, this is the effect that anxiety has on our cognitive performance, right? Let's say we work a standard 9 to 5. Because we have a diminished cognitive capacity by about 25% or more, our work actually takes longer when we do it with an anxious state of mind. Let's say 25%, let's be conservative with our estimate here, because of our smaller cognitive capacity. That 9 to 5 now becomes a 9 to 7. So this range, right, from calm to anxious, it could just as well be from deliberate to reactive. if you look at the psychology behind calm, right? Deliberateness matters with knowledge work, right? A deliberate mind is a calm mind. Calm mind is a productive mind in this way. So, this idea of calm, it's not something that we seek. It's not something I sought until I went through that anxiety episode on stage. But I'm actually grateful for that episode today because it led to such fascinating ideas and research out there. And I hope you'll find what I did, that it also leads to productivity. It also leads to creativity with a less reactive mind. It leads to engagement as we move away from the burnt out side of the spectrum. It leads us to become more focused on what's in front of us. And it lets us connect with more meaning around us too, especially when we eliminate the most stimulating objects of attention in our day. So, thank you so much for coming to the webinar. If you have any questions, do throw them in the Q&A feature. But I don't know where you're at, Michael, but happy to have a chat with you now. And I will exit out my slideshow.
Fantastic.
Hello, sir.
Thank you. I don't know how many people I've made uncalm in my time, but I'm sure way too many. And there's great, learning from how to project calmness in others. It's its own skill set and not break people's calmness. In fact, it sort of goes to one of the questions I've got and one of the comments, and that is relative to some of our principles and ideas, and that is, what is the role potentially of external validation or approval or feedback or recognition in the sort of sort of dimension? Is it its own sort of dimension, particularly when it links to engagement, or is it something different? Sort of when somebody's saying, "Hey, you're actually good," So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, or in your research you came across some thoughts to share.
Yeah, so that would relate to the burnout piece, I think, and the engagement piece for that matter too, where we have these 6 factors that contribute to how burnt out or engaged we are. But burnout, unfortunately, is more prevalent than engagement seems to be, or at least we're on these stepping stones on the way to this burnt out phenomenon. And so reward is indeed one of the 6 factors that leads us to either burnout or feel engaged in what we do. And the research is very clear that reward is more than financial, right? We do need to be paid a fair wage. Stock options count towards how much stress we experience from that factor. Other, compensation alternatives are also in there too. But somebody doing the metaphorical patting us on the back and saying that we did a good job and having that be a genuine instance of praise, it does have to be genuine in order to work. That can mean more than a raise to a lot of people. And I think that's something that is so key, that, the reward factor for burnout plus the community factor for burnout, where we feel connected with those we work alongside, those make work meaningful. Those make work more rewarding for us. In fact, I would argue that all of the factors of burnout do lead us to feel like our work is more rewarding for us, right? Everything from workload, control, fairness, reward, community, and values. We find ourselves in the track, focused, more productive when we experience less stress, when we feel like there's meaning behind each of these 6 factors. So I think the connection is incredibly strong between rewards and engagement, burnout, and calm. Yeah.
And, and on that, and a point that you raised during it was one of the sources of stress in our lives is the sort of amplification of the keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, associated with social media, whose format tends to be, look at me, look how good I am, meaning everything becomes a reference point to the, creators of that content. And it's always a comparison, my lifestyle, or, do I look good, etc. As opposed to the potential, which is that it's actually used to acknowledge others. And that's not to say it's not always like that. Actually, I see a lot of things in LinkedIn, maybe people can relate, that is talking positively about the attributes of others. There's an interesting C-suite strategies article from 2022 I'm going to be posting about it, which is asking employees to judge two different types of managers. One manager that talks about their accomplishments, the other manager is acknowledging the accomplishments of their team and their subordinates, and this question of who would you trust and who would you like to work for. And I can imagine everybody can envision which manager one would prefer to work for and trust and give the best. But anyway, a question that came, we're not going to get to all the questions, we'll do a follow-up. One, there'll be a video of this, the slides. Chris, is it okay for us to get a copy of the slides and distribute for those?
It should be,
people asking that? So we'll absolutely do that. And as I mentioned before, we'll send out some information in terms of to get a copy of Chris's book. And I want to thank Chris before people have to drop off other meetings for taking the time today. It's a pleasure to have you, and I think everybody appreciates that wisdom you're sharing. But we'll see if we get a question or two in. I'm going to group some of the questions together. One of the themes in the questions that you'd all kindly submitted in terms of here was, when you see the let's say the anxiety level in others, whether at home or in a work context, how do you try and help? Are there any tips or suggestions you'd like to share?
Yeah, so it's one of the fascinating things that came up in the research that I found surprising, and that isn't maybe surprising in hindsight, is just how contagious anxiety is, how contagious every emotion is. And so when we're experiencing anxiety, others around us become significantly more likely to experience anxiety as well. And so keep this in mind. If you're a manager, if you're a people manager, modeling is one of the most impactful strategies as a manager if you want to align your team's motivations and behaviors around certain incentives and ideas. And so, simply, I think recognizing the level of anxiety in yourself, really kind of understanding what anxiety is, because a lot of us are anxious, as I was before this journey, without realizing it. I thought it was just a normal human thing to have this feeling of dread often, and to be nervous and around things, and to fret all the time. And I thought I was just a worrier, where it turned out I had anxiety. And when you recognize that there is some level of anxiety, that's something that you can be pragmatic about. It's not something you're stuck with. It's something that you can invest in, the strategies like the ones I shared today. But I think recognizing that level of anxiety in yourself, as well as the people around you. And so because anxiety is so contagious, if you tend to be more on the anxious side of the calm spectrum, you may be receiving that anxiety from other people without even realizing that you are. And so mind your circle of influence, and whether that's something you want to change or not. If it isn't, recognize where that anxiety is coming from, so you can be mindful of it in the moment and have sort of a protective shield of awareness that can prevent you from absorbing too much of that.
A related question quickly, and we've only got a minute or two to respond to that one.
Yeah.
Are you considering offering programs to companies that want to equip their managers with some skill sets? And is that something that they just follow up with you on, or a copy of the book? Of course, we'll be sending out. Any comments on, how an organization trains its managers to be calmer?
Yeah. Oh, so I think more essential now than it has ever been. And that is something I do on the consulting side. I am cutting back on that a little bit as I hunker down on a new writing project, which I seem to have just constants writing projects on the go. But chris@chrisbailey.com is where you can reach out about that.
We'll provide Chris's email contact information associated with the follow-up. As a final one, I want to let you all know to put May 11th on the calendar. If you've got time, we'll of course send a follow-up from 12 to 1. We've got a really interesting speaker, Dr. Uri Gnezi, who is talking about, do incentives really work? And that's associated with a book he's releasing, Mixed Signals, How Incentives Really Work. So that's May 11th from 12 to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. With that, I thank you all for your attendance and participation. There's no point in doing these things if there aren't people showing up, and each month we see a growing population. Chris, once again, thanks for having being part of the show and sharing some of that knowledge and expertise. Calmness is a very relevant theme for this day and age, certainly, and we'll follow up with everybody associated with the materials and to provide address information, and we will send out a copy of Chris's book. With that, I wish everybody a great rest of the week and a calm rest of the afternoon, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.